For years, people who were in that audience told this story differently. Some said a man stood up. Some said he shouted something. Some said Marvin Gaye stopped singing entirely, and the band kept playing without him for almost a full minute. Others swore that never happened at all, that the show went on exactly as planned, smooth and polished, the way Motown shows always did by 1980. But almost no one remembers the part that mattered most. It happened in London during the final stretch of Marvin Gaye's 1980 European tour, a tour that, on paper, looked like a comeback. The reviews had been warm. The crowds had been large. After years of personal turmoil, tax troubles, and a marriage that had quietly come apart, Marvin was back on a stage in front of people who still remembered exactly who he was. The theater that night was full in a way that felt different from the usual full. It wasn't just bodies in seats. It was history in seats. Men and women in their 30s and 40s, some older, many of whom had bought What's Going On the year it came out, in 1971, when the world looked very different. They had carried that record through a decade, through Vietnam, through marches, through funerals, through everything the song had quietly promised to understand. Marvin didn't know any of their names. He never would. But that night, one of them would change the way he thought about that song for the rest of his life. The first half of the show moved the way these shows usually moved by then. Tight, rehearsed, full of the hits the audience expected. Let's Get It On brought the kind of reaction it always brought. Sexual Healing was still new enough to feel like an event. Marvin, now in his early 40s, moved differently than he had in the early Motown years. Slower, more deliberate. A man who had learned that stillness on stage could be its own kind of power. Backstage before the show, he had been quiet. Not nervous exactly. Marvin rarely looked nervous by this point in his career, but distant. One of the musicians who toured with him that year would later describe him as a man who seemed to be somewhere else, even while he was talking to you. He asked, almost in passing, whether the set list still had What's Going On near the end. It did. It always did. But that night, he asked twice. No one thought much of it at the time. Marvin asked small, repetitive questions often, about lighting, about sound levels, about which microphone had been used the night before. It was simply how he managed the quiet anxiety that lived underneath the calm exterior the audience saw. But looking back, those who were there would later wonder if some part of him already knew the song was going to feel different that night. By the time the band moved into the familiar opening notes, that loose, conversational bass line, the soft brush of the drums, the horns easing in like they were arriving late to a party, the room had already shifted. People who had been talking quietly between songs went still. Some closed their eyes before Marvin had even sung a word. The song didn't need an introduction. Everyone in that theater had lived inside it for almost a decade. Marvin began to sing. His voice that night was different from the record, rounder, more worn, carrying the weight of everything that had happened to him since 1971. He sang the first verse the way he always did, eyes half closed, body swaying gently, the microphone held loosely, almost casually, as if he were singing to one person rather than 2,000. And then, near the front of the theater, a man stood up. He wasn't young. He was somewhere in his late 30s, dressed simply, sitting close enough to the stage that Marvin could see him clearly under the lights. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms. He simply stood, slowly, the way someone stands when their legs move before their mind has decided anything. For a moment, nothing happened. The band kept playing. The horns held their line. Marvin kept singing, his eyes drifting across the crowd the way they always did, until they reached the man standing in the front row. And then Marvin stopped singing. Not abruptly, not with any visible alarm. He simply let the next line pass, his mouth not moving, his eyes locked on the man below him. The band, trained over years to follow Marvin's cues without needing to be told, softened automatically. The horns thinning out, the rhythm section easing back, until the music became something closer to a held breath than a performance. For several seconds, the theater was almost silent. 2,000 people, and the loudest sound in the room was the faint hum of the amplifiers. The man in the front row was crying, not dramatically, quietly, the way people cry when they've been holding something in for a very long time and finally stop trying. He didn't look away from Marvin. Marvin didn't look away from him. No one in that theater knew, in that moment, what the man's life had been. They didn't know he had spent 2 years in Vietnam in the late 1960s, and that he had come home to a country that didn't quite know what to do with him. They didn't know that what's going on had been one of the only things in the years afterward that had made him feel like someone out there understood. Not with answers, but with the question itself. What's going on? Not an accusation, not a protest chant, just a question, asked gently by someone who genuinely wanted to know. Marvin didn't know the specifics either, but something in the man's face told him enough. Later, people who were close to Marvin would say he had a particular sensitivity to pain in a room, that he could feel it before he could explain it, the way some people can tell when weather is about to change. After what felt to everyone there like much longer than it actually was, though by all accounts it was less than a minute, Marvin did something that no one expected and that almost no review or recording from that night fully captured. He didn't continue the song from where he'd left off. He went back. He nodded to the band quietly, and they slid back into the first verse, the same lines Marvin had already sung minutes earlier. But this time, he sang them differently, slower, softer. Looking, for most of it, directly at the man still standing in the front row, who by now had been gently encouraged back into his seat by the people around him, though he never stopped watching Marvin either. It wasn't a performance anymore. For those few minutes, it felt like something closer to a private conversation that 2,000 people happened to be allowed to witness. When the song ended, there was no immediate applause. For a moment, just a moment, the silence continued, as if the audience needed permission to return to being an audience. And then it came, not as the roaring, triumphant ovation that usually followed what's going on, but as something quieter, sustained, almost reverent. Marvin didn't say anything about it. He didn't acknowledge the man directly, didn't make a speech, didn't turn the moment into a story for the crowd. He simply moved into the next song, the way he always did, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. But something had happened, And the people who were there that night, really there, paying attention, knew it. Afterward, backstage, Marvin reportedly asked one of the crew members if they had seen the man near the front. The crew member hadn't noticed anything unusual. Marvin didn't explain further. He simply said, quietly, that the song had felt different that night, that for the first time in a long time, he felt like he understood why he'd written it in the first place. He never spoke about the moment publicly. There was no interview afterward where he described the man in the front row, no anecdote repeated for journalists, no mention of it in the years that followed. It existed only in the memories of the people who were in that theater. And in those memories, the story would slowly start to drift, the way memories do. Some remembered Marvin stopping for a full minute. Some remembered him walking toward the edge of the stage. Some weren't sure anything had happened at all, only that the song that night had felt longer or heavier than usual, without quite knowing why. What almost no one remembered, what almost no one had even noticed, was the simplest part of all. That for those few minutes, in a crowded theater in 1980, the song "What's Going On" had stopped being a performance and had become, for just a moment, exactly what it had always been written to be. A question asked quietly by one person to anyone who might be listening. And on that night, in that room, someone finally answered it back. That is the part of the story that mattered most. And it is the part that for years, almost everyone forgot.